to the party, all right? All right, let's talk about sex. It's funny, this week, I was in the car with my 9-year-old daughter, and she's like, "You're starting a new series, Dad, aren't you? Are you starting a new series?" I said, "Yeah." She's like, "It's that new one, right?" I said, "Yep." She said, "Are you going to be talking about sex?" I said, "Yep." And she said, "Oh, that's cool." I said, "You know about sex?" She said, "Yeah." 9 years old. I said, "You do?" She said, "Yes." I said, "What is it?" She said, "It's like gender." I said, "Yep." How many of you know 9 years old, that conversation is coming up soon? It's coming up soon. And, we live in a day, it's a different day. Sex is everywhere. And, all you have to do is have email, and you're confronted with it. I just took a group of men a couple months ago through a book called Strong Fathers, Strong Daughters. And they talked about the age 8, 9, 10, kids become aware of what sex is, and to get on the front end, begin having these conversations and help to shape point of view. And the reality is, all of us, this is like probably as relevant of a topic as we can have. Like if I was to talk today specifically about marriage, or if I was to talk about forgiveness, it may hit some of us really hard because that's where we're at. But to those who are unmarried or those who aren't dealing specifically with an issue of forgiveness right now, it may not be quite as relevant. But sex is something we all deal with, and so we have to figure out how do we do this in a healthy way. What does this look like? And I want to first of all challenge you in every area of your life, but specifically in this area, for you to think like a leader. Think like a leader, not like a follower. Think like a leader. So many times the peer pressure of our culture causes us to label certain ideas antiquated, or to kind of fall into pop cultural ways of thinking about things like sex and money and parties and all these things we're going to talk about. And if we're not careful, pretty soon we get swept up in the common thinking. And, we not only train our children, but we should train ourselves to think like leaders. We say things like, well, if everybody jumped off a bridge, you wouldn't do that, right? Well, but Dad, everybody's doing it. But Mom, everybody's doing it. Well, but if everybody was, you wouldn't do that. Well, as adults, we need to think the same way, because what we tend to do sometimes is go, well, that's antiquated, that's old school, that might have been good for Grandpa and Grandma, that might have been good for Mom and Dad, but I'm evolved. The rules don't apply to me. And so what I want to do is I want to challenge you, encourage you to think like a leader. And actually, thinking like a leader starts with who you're going to follow. Starts with who you're going to follow. Because if you decide, I'm just going to follow myself, I'm going to do what feels right to me, that's a massive mistake. People that think like that usually end up with just a whole lot of scars, a whole lot of wounds, a whole lot of dumb mistakes. And then at the end of their lives, they end up saying the things that the Bible said it to begin with. They could have just got on course early. Otherwise, they could learn from the school of hard knocks, and they look back and go, man, I should have done it that way. And so it really starts with we're following God. Now, I want to put up real quick a refresher for some of you, and some of you this might be new, but we actually talk around here about the stages of spiritual growth for a person. And we actually use stages of human development to reflect, to give us a picture of what spiritual development looks like. And it's a kid, teenager, adult. Okay? Kid, teenager, adult. We have it up on the screen across the top, a baby, teenager, adult. A baby, little kids, they, grow quickly, develop quickly, but you have to teach a child to obey. I've got a 3-year-old son right now, a 6-year-old son. I'm just teaching, obey what I say, obey what I say. A lot of times they don't want to do what I say, but you got to do what I say, because I know things you don't know. My ways are higher than your ways, son. My thoughts are higher than your thoughts. You need to do what I'm telling you to do, because I know what I'm talking about, and I want to help you. I'm putting boundaries around you for your good. And so it's the same thing. When you come to Christ, you might be 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 years old, and yet you have to learn to obey God. We obey God. And it's a massive piece of it. And, you know, a lot of times you think back when you were a kid and your parents told you to do something, and they said obey, and you fought them. You said, why? And they said, what? What did they say? Because I said so. Remember that? Because I said so. Now, because I said so only works for so long. It works for a little bit when you're a little tiny kid, because I don't have time to explain. I'm not able to explain, and you're not able to understand at 3 years old why I'm telling you to do this. You just need to trust my character. Because I said so, in essence, is only really reflecting the character of the person who's issuing the order. So what I'm saying is I'm your dad, I'm your mom, I'm trustworthy, and when I say to do it, just because I said so, just do it. And I'll just tell you this, friend. As evolved as we want to think we are, and as times we think we're really smart and that the rules don't apply to us, there are certain times we do need to just obey God because he said so. We do. I know that's out of style. It's not in vogue anymore. We're so liberated. But there are some times, friend, I'll just tell you, just obey God. Why? Because he said so, because his ways are higher than your ways. His thoughts are higher than your thoughts. And I'm going to trust that he's not trying to hurt me, that if he would send Jesus to die for my sin, if he loved me that much, if his love was that deep, that if he's prohibiting me from doing something or he's putting a boundary around me, he's trying to protect me. How many of you know boundaries are not all bad? Anybody been to the zoo lately? Anybody thankful for the boundaries at the zoo? Without the boundaries at the zoo, you end up eaten by the lions, okay? Without boundaries, your car could drive off a bridge. Okay, boundaries. In fact, I'll tell you, there is enough electricity, there's enough electrical current in this room, pumping through this room right now, to kill everyone in here. The only reason that we're not in danger is because of boundaries, because of the conduit, because it's been brought into compliance, it's been brought into submission. And so there's a certain amount. We just need to obey because he said so. But there's more to it than that. And what I want to do today, because I understand as you get older and you evolve, when you were a teenager, and this I said so thing, if you didn't go beyond just I said so into why. Why did your parents tell you to do that? Why are you telling me this, God? If that's the case, if you don't understand the why, you won't stick with it. So today what I want to talk to you is, I'm not going to talk to you about how to have sex, because you got that all figured out, right? That's not hard to figure out. What I want to talk to you is about why. I'll talk to you about why. I want to talk to you about what God says and why God says it. First of all, I want to talk about, help you understand the way that God, now understand, God was the creator of sex. God created sex. And he created it a certain way. We know obviously about the procreation aspect of sex, that the way that sperm and egg come together and how a new life is born and all of that type of stuff. But just think about the grand designer. Think about God and how he made this thing to work. And what he did was he added to this, beyond just the physical component, a spiritual component and a psychological component. He made it to be a very climactic, pleasurable experience. Aren't you thankful? Isn't God good? I mean, he could have just made it, just sort of this robotic deal. In fact, most of the animal kingdom, they don't feel pleasure like what we feel. When it comes to people, God said, I'm going to bring this thing. It's going to be a unifying thing, and it's going to also be something that's tremendously pleasurable. Now, let me help you understand scientifically what happens when you have sex. Actually, in your mind, in your brain, there's a chemical release that happens during sex of 4 different kinds of chemicals. The first one is adrenaline. Okay, adrenaline. It's the same thing you get when you go to Cedar Point, and you're going down the Steel Vengeance. You're going on the top thrill dragster, and you get that shot of adrenaline. I mean, you are just, it's crazy. It's amazing. You're focused. It's unbelievable. You get done, and you're just like, whoo, let's do that again. All right, adrenaline. The second is serotonin. Serotonin is what brings happiness. So it's a great feeling of pleasure and happiness. The third is oxytocin. Oxytocin brings closeness. It's It's the attachment chemical. It's what causes you to be emotionally linked and attached to someone. In fact, when a woman's giving birth, she releases some oxytocin. It's the connection. It's the connection that a mother has to that child. It bonds you. It connects you. In fact, if you look actually all the way back to the beginning of the Bible, in Genesis 2, okay, before sex even happened, when God was creating male and female, God created man first, and then in Genesis 2, he's getting ready to create a woman as a companion to the man. And in verse 18, look, it says this: "Then the Lord God said, it's not good for man to be alone." It's not good for a person to be alone. I'm going to bring this helpmate, this companion into his life. And it's going to be more than just sex. It's going to be two people working together, two people living in intimacy. But one of the chemical releases that happens during sex bonds you and connects you. This is why when you introduce sex into a relationship, it just takes it to the next level in terms of your bond. This is why, by the way, when you're lonely, when you're living in a state of loneliness, you are particularly prone to sexual temptation, to desiring to be intimate with somebody. And so you got to be careful about that. And then the fourth one is dopamine, which actually causes you to be numb to pain and stress. Also makes you tired. But dopamine is released, and so this is why, again, if you're going through a season in your life where you're really stressed out, you got all this pressure, all this stress, that's another reason why sexual temptation or consistent sex is something that you desire. Why? Because it's a fast, quick stress reliever. And so when you look at this, okay, I want you to think about the fact that this is, by the way, this is God's design. God designed it for you to have, within the intimacy of sex, with one other person, for you to have a natural high. These four chemicals, by the way, are the same four chemicals that are often exploited in drugs. All right, serotonin is in amphetamines. Dopamine is in cocaine. Oxytocin is in ecstasy. So if you have sex, okay, when you're having sex, it's like taking ecstasy, snorting coke while riding a roller coaster. All right. Got a few witnesses up in here. Now, I read a book a few years ago called The Power of When. It was the author is a sleep specialist. And the premise of his book was, he said, what humans do, humans, because we have these evolved, really intellectual brains, these really smart brains, what we do is we actually outthink our system and we end up out of bounds. So what he did was he compared humans to animals. Animals are instinctive creatures. Animals do everything the way God designed them, everything. They sleep when their instincts tell them to sleep. They eat, not only when their instincts tell them to eat, but what their instincts tell them to eat. They mate at certain times. Everything is very instinctive. Animals don't have the ability to outthink their system. They just do it instinctively. And that's why you look at animals and they're healthy. You've never seen a squirrel with an eating disorder. You haven't. You've never seen a deer bound up in anxiety. You've never seen an animal that's outside. Why? Because they do exactly what they've been programmed to do. Squirrels don't need 3 Starbucks every morning. They don't need tons of caffeine driving down the highway. Why? Because they sleep when they're supposed to sleep. They eat when they're supposed to eat. They mate when they're supposed to mate. They do everything the way God is programmed to do. And then God creates humans, and he gives us these big, huge, evolved brains. And what we do is because we're so stinking smart, we become prideful, and we go, well, we're going to just create stuff. We're going to figure stuff out. We're not going to sleep when we're programmed to sleep. What we're going to do is look at our cell phone for hours and shoot Blu-rays into our eyes at 11 p.m. So we're exhausted the next morning because I keep shooting Blu-rays into my eyes and I can't get into a good sleep. So we end up with sleeping disorders. You know what we do? We engineer food because it make it taste better and better and better than what's natural. And then we become addicted to it and our bodies get all out of whack. And guess what we do? We do the same thing with sex, right? We get the natural high that God's created for us to have with all of these natural chemical releases in the proper dose. that God created, and we go, wow, that felt good. Let's make cocaine. Wow, that felt good. Let's make ecstasy. Wow, that felt good. Let's create pornography. Wow, that felt good. Let's do it with multiple partners. Wow, that felt good. Let's go way outside the boundary. Man, that one felt good. Maybe I'll do more and more and more and more and more. And what we do is we go outside the boundary. We end up actually breaking the laws, the rules, the way that God created it to be, not so he could stifle our good time, so that we could have it in the moderation it was intended to be, so that you can actually enjoy it to the maximum. Now let me help you understand something. There's a term called the law of diminishing marginal utility. All right, the law of diminishing marginal utility. The law of diminishing marginal utility is basically that when you increase consumption of something while keeping consumption of other products constant, there's a decline in the gain that you derive from consuming each additional unit of the product. So basically, sometimes less is more. I'll give you a great example. Let me show you an example of increased marginal utility. So if you have a stool with two legs, it's pretty much useless. You had one leg, and you've increased the marginal utility of the stool. Now it's useful. If you have a card deck with 51 cards, it's an incomplete deck. You can't really play a game fairly because you don't have the complete deck. You had one card of the 52 cards, and now you have a complete deck. Now the entire thing has more utility. That's increased marginal utility. What we tend to think with sex, pleasure, is increase marginal utility. More sex, more partners, more stuff, more images, more stimulation, and we think that that's going to make us enjoy it more, but actually it's the law of decreased marginal utility. If you do more and more and more, you actually enjoy it less. For example, some of you have discovered the law of diminishing marginal utility around gummy bears. Okay. Start eating gummy bears. The first few is like, this is great. You eat a little bit more, you eat a little bit more. How many of you know, after like the 57th gummy bear, you start to get sick? You're not meant to eat 14 donuts. Anybody, I mean, that first donut, you're hungry, you're like, oh my gosh, I just want to eat this donut. Somewhere around the third donut, it's just, you hit diminishing marginal utility. You keep doing it, it actually produces a worse result, and you enjoy it less. In fact, by the way, when the Bible talks about fasting, when you fast, what you're doing, fasting not only is a time to not eat or to fast something for the point of focusing now on God, but what it also does is it helps you to get your appetite under control. And when you take time to say, you know, I'm not going to just satiate this appetite. I'm not going to just keep more and more and more and more and more. You actually learn to control that appetite. When you control that appetite, you're actually able to have greater degrees of pleasure. You're enjoying it. Why? Because you put it into moderation. Now, I'm going to tell you, this is today more than ever, especially as it relates to sex. Today more than ever, we have to be cognizant of this as it relates to sex, because nowadays sex is more, you can have more connection to it than ever before based on the internet. You know, back in the day, Wilt Chamberlain came out, wrote a book years ago and said, he slept with some crazy number, 10,000 women or something like that. Everybody's like, oh my goodness, how in the world? Well, guess what? Anybody can sleep with 10,000 people now. Anybody can. You can go right to the internet. The internet's got this buffet of sex that you can just look and you can completely fill your mind with. And what happens when you do that is now your appetite gets overblown. You actually have diminishing marginal utility. In fact, what they're starting to study, and by the way, let's just for a moment take out the religious, spiritual, oh, this is what the pastor says, oh, he's just a prude and blah, blah, blah. Okay, forget that. Heathens and unsaved people, atheists, are studying this, and they're realizing that people who are overindulging their appetites, they're seeing impotence in men in their 20s. Why? Because of diminishing marginal utility. You're not getting the same release, so now you got to go more and crazier and wilder just to get the same deal. Your body's not meant for that. God created this pleasure, this mental chemical release, this natural high to happen within a certain boundary. And if you go outside of that thinking that more is more, you're going to find out that that's not true. Then you end up bound, and you got to just consume this high level just to feel normal. They're finding people aren't even able to bond. Many of them aren't even able to have a normal, healthy sex life because they bought the lie. They did more and more. I'm going to show you this actually in the scripture. So I'm going to real quick. I'm going to give you a quick background, and I got to go fast here. But okay, real fast. Can you listen fast? I'll talk fast, and I'll get out of your way, and you go get lunch. Okay. All right. So in the Old Testament, 1 Samuel 8, the nation had never had a king. The elders of the nation said, we want a king because all the other nations have a king, and it's really cool to have a king, and kings are working now, so we want a king. So they go to Samuel, and they say, Samuel, will you go to God and have him give us a king? Samuel's like, but God's the king. They're like, we don't want God to be a king, we want a king. So Samuel goes to God and says, God, they want a king. And God's like, you know what, Samuel, don't take it personally. They've rejected me as king. They don't want to listen to me. They want to serve themselves. They want a king, so fine, give them a king. But give them this warning, he says, 1 Samuel 8. Give them this warning. If a man is a king, here's what's going to happen. He's going to take your daughters. He's going to do whatever he wants with them. He's going to take your sons, and he's going to do whatever he wants. He's going to build shrines to himself. And God says men should not be kings. King's a bad idea. He will overindulge. It's just too tempting. It's too tempting. Even the good ones will mess up. Even the good ones will end up self-indulging. It's just a bad idea. So Samuel goes to the nation. Guys, I'm telling you, you don't want a king. It's a bad idea. They're like, we want a king. Okay, here's a king. So give him a king, Saul. Saul starts out humble, ends up absolute megalomaniac. I mean, he's just off the charts, arrogant, prideful tyrant to the place that he tries to kill his own son, ends up dying in a heap of flames because the power went to his head. Next up, David. David, man after God's own heart. God said, I've been looking all over, trying to find somebody with a great heart that can lead this nation. Oh, there's David out there. He's a shepherd, and he turns him from a shepherd into a warrior, and then he goes from a warrior into a king. And David, who was just a good old boy, like the one you'd want to marry your daughter, ends up getting out there, and he goes, oh, this king thing's kind of cool. He adapted to king. He had been a shepherd for a long time, but now he's like, this king thing's kind of cool. They bring you food, and there's women everywhere. So he took 7 wives, and in fact, he took another man's wife at one point when he was supposed to be back in his warrior mode and go out into battle. He decided not to because indulgent felt so good. I can sleep in. And then he looked on the roof, and he sees another man's wife named Bathsheba, and he asked somebody, who is that? And they said, well, and this is what they said. When he asked who that is, that's this man's daughter and this man's wife. David said, yeah, probably shouldn't, but I'm the king. What the heck? Bring me another donut. So she comes up, gets her pregnant, ends up murdering her husband because she's pregnant and he's got to cover his tracks, has her husband murdered. This is the good guy, by the way. This is the man after God's own heart. This is the one that God said, I've been looking in the world to try to find a man who can. Then there's Solomon. Next one. Solomon, who was brilliant, wise, saw his dad have 7 wives and saw his dad living a luxurious lifestyle, and now this king thing is starting to look pretty cool. And now his son says, forget the law of diminishing marginal utility. I like women. He had 700 wives, 300 concubines. If you don't know what a concubine is, Google it later. It's fun to check it out. It's a wife with no strings attached. 1,000 women at his disposal. He's like, yeah, this is going to be great. Now, one of the advantages we have of Solomon is he wrote 3 books. So we get to see his thought progression over 3 different books over years and decades of time to see how his life played out. The first book he wrote was Song of Solomon. In Song of Solomon, he writes this romantic book. In fact, this is where he's at. He's writing about a monogamous relationship, one man, one woman, and he writes about it, and he says, this is what it's like. Song of Solomon 4, 1-7. You are beautiful, my darling, beautiful beyond words. Your eyes are like doves behind your veil. Your hair falls like waves, like a flock of goats winding down the slopes of Gilead. By the way, if you're just not good with words and you're not very romantic, just read a little Song of Solomon. It'll do wonders for you. Song of Solomon 4:1-7. Your teeth are like white as sheep. I mean, what could be more romantic than that? Recently shorn and freshly washed. Your smile is flawless, each tooth matched with its twin. Your lips are like scarlet ribbon. Your mouth is inviting. Your cheeks are like rosy pomegranates behind your veil. He's describing a one-on-one monogamous relationship, just completely blown away with her beauty. He can't say. Your neck is as beautiful as a tower of David, jeweled with the shields of 1,000 heroes. Your breasts are like two fawns. Twin fawns of a gazelle grazing among the lilies. I don't know if that's a compliment or not, but I think he meant it to be one. Verse 6, before the dawn breezes blow the night and the shadows flee, I will hurry to the mountain of myrrh and to the hill of frankincense. And you are altogether beautiful, my darling, beautiful in every way. I mean, this guy is just, this is increased marginal utility. This is, oh my gosh, you complete me. This is amazing. This is poetic. This is Solomon, one man, one woman. Solomon goes into Proverbs, and he's like, let me give advice to people in Proverbs 5:18-20 says, let your wife be a fountain of blessing to you. Rejoice in the wife of your youth. The wife of your youth, not the wives of your youth, the wife, the one woman. Just enjoy the wife of you. She's a loving deer, a graceful doe. Let her breast satisfy you always. May you always be captivated by her love. Just you and her. Increased marginal utility. The two of you working together. The two of you being focused on each other. Just the two of you. Why be captivated, my son, by an immoral woman or fondle the breasts of a promiscuous woman? So here he is. He's experienced one-on-one love. A committed monogamous relationship. Now he's telling everybody to do it in Proverbs. And somewhere between Song of Solomon and your hair is like, a cascading waterfall. And just love the wife of your youth. Somewhere he decides, I'm going to have a bunch of donuts. I'm going to eat more and more. I'm going to indulge myself. I'm going to have as much as I want to have. And he denies and tries to disprove the law of diminishing marginal utility. And he thinks more is better as it relates to sex. Man, that high felt good. I want a more high and a bigger high. So he goes with 1,000 women. 1,000. And then he writes Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes, he writes it toward the end of his life. And this is why you got to read the Bible with context. Because if you just opened Ecclesiastes and you didn't understand, you start reading it, you get really depressed. But when you understand Solomon, you understand what he did. You understand the mistakes he made. He was wise. This is wisdom literature. He was wise enough to know, I should stay with one woman. But he blew out his appetites. And here he is at the end of his life, doing what all of us do when we live our mistakes. You live through the pain and the regret of your mistakes. You try to help the next generation. You try to go, guys, don't do what I did. Don't walk where I walked. Don't make the same mistake I made. And this is what he tells the young leaders, the young aristocrats in Israel. He says, listen, I said to myself, come, let's try pleasure. This is Ecclesiastes 2:1-8. Let's look for good things in life, but I found this too was meaningless. I said, laughter is silly. What good is it to seek pleasure? After much thought, I decided to cheer myself with wine. And while still seeking wisdom, I clutched at foolishness. In this way, I tried to experience the only happiness most people have during this brief life in this world. I also tried to find meaning by building huge homes for myself. Okay, what he's describing here is he just tried to completely satisfy his appetites over and try to find pleasure on top of pleasure. He said, I tried to plant beautiful vineyards. I made gardens and parks, filling them with all kinds of trees. I built reservoirs to collect water to irrigate many flourishing groves. I bought slaves, both men and women, and they were born into my household. And look at this, I owned herds and flocks and all of this stuff. He gets down to verse 8. I collected great sums of silver and gold, treasure of many kings and provinces. Look at this. I hired singers, both men and women, and had many beautiful concubines. I had sex more than anybody who had ever lived at that point, Solomon says. I had more sex than you could ever dream of. He said, I had everything a man could desire. And at the end of this, verse 11, he says, but I looked at everything and I had worked so hard to accomplish, and it was all so meaningless, like chasing the wind. There was nothing really worthwhile anywhere. Now look at this. He keeps droning on and on and on. Chapter 7, look at this. This is where you get, by the way. Let this be a cautionary tale to you. This is where you get if you don't understand the law of diminishing marginal utility and you decide that sex is just physical and you neglect the physiological, psychological, spiritual component, and you just, hey, if there's two willing parties, it's a lot of fun, let's just get into it, and you just think that's all it is, all this stuff is antiquated, and you miss the way God created you. Here's the guy that overindulged himself, and this is where he ends up, Ecclesiastes 7, 27 through 29. He said, this is my conclusion. I have discovered that after looking at this matter from every possible angle, though I have searched repeatedly, I have not found what I was looking for. Only 1 out of 1,000 men is virtuous, but not one woman. What? What? Verse 29. But I did find this. God created people to be virtuous, but they have but they have turned to follow their own downward path. When you take this wonderful thing God has created, designed it with a chemical release for you to be bonded to a person, inside the commitment of marriage, and you put it within that, it is a natural high that's supposed to play inside of that boundary. If not, you end up with this kind of thinking, nobody's virtuous. Nobody's virtuous. All men are that way. All women are that way. And you know what? God has set up a path. He says here in verse 29, God created people to be virtuous, but they have turned to follow their own downward path. Let me tell you something. Let me define this for you. A great sex life is outside the box, but inside the boundary. Don't you just wish that somehow you could have taken Solomon in Ecclesiastes when he's going, it's all meaningless. It's all ridiculous. I've had all the highs that money can buy. I've had more than everybody's ever had. Wouldn't you love to just go, hey man, let's go back to Song of Solomon. Remember that thing you wrote? Remember what you had? Was that meaningless? Was that monogamous relationship? Was that meaningless? That was not meaningless. That's exactly how God intended it to be. But because he decided to do it his way, he ends up completely taking this beautiful gift and actually cheapening it, because sometimes less is more. See, a great sex life is outside the box, inside the boundary. The boundary is marriage. The boundary is this. When I know that I have the security and the safety of someone who has committed, two people committing to put Christ at the center of their relationship, and to commit to not leave each other till death do us part. A lot of people, when you start talking about sex and sex inside of marriage, it seems like God has a lot of rules, but it's actually God's plans of protection for us. So, it's not that God wants to give us less life. God wants to give us abundant life. I can tell you, as somebody who's experienced some of the beauty of that, I think when you put it in the packaging and in the boundary God's created, you're actually able to experience some real intimacy, some real transparency when you're not dragging other people into your bedroom with you, that you can actually be transparent with someone. Friend, I've counseled hundreds of people, both Christians and not Christians, who some of their greatest pain, some of their greatest regret, some of their greatest psychological wounds are related to sexual issues. And so I just think we're being a little bit irresponsible if we just say, you know what, two willing parties, it's just physical, it's a whole lot of fun, let's just go after it. To say, you know what, let's look at it God's way. Here's my last thing for you, and then you do it this. Whatever you want to do is this, my first to single people. Trust God's plan for sex. Stay within the boundary, wait till you're married. Trust God's plan for sex. Trust it. Obey it. Why? Well, kind of because he said so, but because this is how he's wired you. So just have the wisdom to look up and go, yeah, I don't want that life. Yeah, I want to play within that boundary because that is actually going to be the max efficiency, effectiveness, pleasure, and bonding and intimacy that I'm going to be able to have if I do it his way. So trust God's plan for sex. Stay within the boundary. If you've gone outside the boundary, get back in the boundary. Get back in the boundary. Yeah, but we've moved in together. Yeah, you can move back out. Oh, but it'll be double the rent. Yeah, you'll survive. Yeah, but we started, it's going to be difficult to stop. Okay, then what you need to do is decide, are we supposed to be getting married? Because if you're not supposed to get married, then do you want to keep bonding yourself and having this chemical release of your brain with the same person that eventually you're going to have to unstick yourself to and restick yourself to somebody else, and they're going to stick to somebody else? Just do it God's way. Move out. Just commit now. You know what? Can't change the past. We can be forgiven for what we've done right now. We're going to stop, cut bait, move on. And if we decide now, we're going to decide we're going to get married. If we do, let's do it, and let's do it God's way when we've made the ultimate commitment. Married people, stay within the boundary, but take the lid off the box. Stay within the boundary. Don't go outside your marriage. Don't go outside to other people. Don't go outside to other images. Stay within the boundary God's created for you. But by all means, within that box, within that boundary, take the lid off the box and have a good time. Let's pray.